answer to the question that nobody has ever asked, or the most innovative step any motorcycle manufacturer has made in a generation in terms of front-end grip. The holy grail of motorcycling. This is the Yamaha Niken. So we gave you a preview of Niken back in November, December time, 6 months ago at Motorcycle Live, and there's been quite a lot to say from you guys about this bike on social media. Now we're here to answer a couple of questions. Primarily, why? Also, how do you pronounce Niken? That's exactly how you pronounce it, Niken, and it means two swords. Here they are. Two swords. During this piece, we're going to ride the bike in Kitzbühel. We're also going to get under the skin, actually take these clothes off and show you exactly what is going on under there. So why did we go to Kitzbühel? Aside from the fact that Yamaha took us to Kitzbühel, it turns out it was the perfect place to test the front end and indeed the whole of the Niken concept. Now, Kitzbühel itself is A, beautiful, but B, it's quite a challenging riding environment. 1 minute you can be on a perfectly straight road, the next minute you're in a hairpin that has stacks of potholes and is just quite a tough place to ride. Also, bizarrely for me, it was the first time that a manufacturer has looked for a place on purpose with changeable weather conditions. They wanted us to experience this bike in the dry, but they really wanted us to experience it in the wet as well. Kitzbühel offered everything that they were looking for, and it turns out it was the perfect place to go and ride. One thing that Kitzbühel also offers is 365-day-a-year skiing. They wanted us to experience the carving nature of skiing and then try and relate it to the carving nature of the front end on this bike. Now, they did take us skiing. I was utterly useless. Picture the scene. I'm wearing everything that I'm wearing on the bike, but I'm on a set of planks and I'm just crashing all the time. Spent most of it upside down. It was rubbish. Skiing sucks. So we're going to rattle through the technical specification of everything from pretty much the headstock back. You'll understand all of that bit because you'll have seen it 1,000 times before. We'll save most of this piece to try and describe everything that's going on up here technically, and then I'm going to tell you what it's like to ride. So Niken runs CP3 motor, the one that I loved in XSR, MT09, GT Tracer that we shot recently. That's the triple cylinder, 115 horsepower and 87 Newton meters of torque attached to a swing arm that's carrying a 17-inch wheel with a single piston ABS mounted caliper. 820 millimeters from the ground you'll find the seat, and the overall wheelbase of this bike is 1510 millimeters. And the big question, one that you've also been asking a lot online, is the width. The overall width of this bike is 885 millimeters. Fully loaded with fuel and oil, Niken weighs 263 kilograms. There's an 18-litre fuel tank, which Yamaha are claiming will take you 300 kilometers. If you've test ridden anything from Yamaha recently, you'll feel quite at home when you plonk your hands on the bars. All of the buttons are pretty much identical to everything else that you'll see on their range. So, the parallelogram principle of a LMW, which is what Yamaha call their leaning multi-wheelers. They've been at this for years. I think they had a concept back at the bike show in 2004. They've dabbled with the idea of leaning multi-wheeled vehicles for a long time, easily over 10 years. So this is nothing new to them. Also, this section of the bike is nothing new to us. We know how good CP3 is, we know how good MT09s are. This section of the bike is proven to you, this section of the bike is understood and proven to Yamaha. So surely, bringing those two things together should equal something amazing. Let's take the clothes off this bike and have a look at what's going on underneath. From the ground up, let's start with wheels and tires. A 15-inch front wheel, correction, two 15-inch front wheels, 265mm discs, 4-piston calipers on both sides. Now you might be wondering why this bike only has a 15-inch front wheel. Yamaha obviously experimented with larger and smaller, and it came down to a couple of questions. The first was centrifugal force and the gyroscopic effects of a 17-inch front wheel. When you're able to do the speeds that this bike can do, and you're able to lean like this bike can do, the masses, once they built some centrifugal force, were just too big with a standard 17-inch front wheel. It is a bike, despite having 3 wheels, because A, it's not classed as a trike on paper. I think you need 465 millimeters of gap between your front wheels to be classed as a trike. This is actually only 410, and also it leans like a motorbike, and also if you take it off the side stand and walk away, when you come back, it will have fallen over, just like a motorbike. So the brakes have ABS. Moving up, we're going to come to the Niken part of the bike, the two-sword principle. These two forks both have a different role to play in the Niken riding game. The one at the back is your adjustable one. This is the one that you're used to having on your bike. The forward fork is the one that helps with tracking and direction. If you took this front fork away, these two front wheels would spin around like a crazy shopping trolley does at the supermarket. So as most of you have commented on a lot of the videos that I do, I struggle to smile and I sometimes look like I'm having a miserable time doing these jobs. I actually love doing what I'm doing, but there's no way on earth that I'm going to be able to give you any kind of proper understanding of what's going on in here without the help of a grown-up. So I'm going to chuck a couple of pretty riding shots at you while I go and find the man from Yamaha who's going to help us understand exactly what's going on here. So Jeff Turner, the lovely guy from Yamaha who knows everything about anything to do with Yamaha, who gave me my first piece of homework on this bike back in November at the bike show. Here we are now, and we're going to have a conversation about this from top to bottom, and at the end we're all going to understand it as much as you.
Let's hope so.
Maybe. So my initial understanding of it is, if you look at these forks from the side on, you can almost see a headstock here. Underneath there, it's as you would find on a regular motorcycle. So what we've got is a headstock, a lower clamp here holding two forks. But obviously the motorbike's going this way and not this way, and you've got the same thing at your end. So before you start unexplaining what I'm cocking up at the minute, I can actually see 1, 2, 3, 4 headstocks.
Effectively, yes. Yeah, effectively. And it's exactly as you described. So this cast section here has a head race bearing, effectively top and bottom.
Yep.
And you quite rightly say this is like a bottom yoke or a bottom triple cramp.
Yep.
And that has a stem that goes through and it connects to here in exactly the same way as you would find underneath your top yoke or your top clamp. To take it one stage further, this is a completely separate piece, held on bearings, top and bottom, 2 to secure, 1 to hold it from moving. And these are only going up and down on a central pivot point in parallel with each other with the arms. When you lean, effectively, that's what happens. So these are staying in parallel with each other. That is going through a vertical plane square to the bike. The bike is now leant over, but the suspension is still working via the forks completely independently. And
so this is us going around a right-hand bend, isn't it?
It is indeed. You're leant over to the right now. And as you probably saw, there's no friction.
No.
Virtually. The only friction is in the bearings. There's no damping, there's no springing. This is why it feels like a two-wheeler to ride. Because you're effectively going through a single pivot point, albeit that that's then connected to two wheels.
So before we continue, one of the questions we posed at the start of this piece is, why has Yamaha done exactly what they've done here? And as I said, it's all about increasing that confidence and grit that you get from the front end of a bike. If you double the size of your contact patch, it's fair to say, we're not saying that you're doubling the amount of grip that you have. Isn't it about an 80% improvement? Is that what we discussed, loosely speaking?
Yeah, we're talking about contact patch in terms of grip.
Yes.
So the reason that the contact patch is not 100% bigger is that the wheels are 15-inch as opposed to 17-inch. So a 15-inch wheel has a smaller contact patch. So therefore you've actually got 2 smaller contact patches.
But collectively it's more than the single 17-inch one.
So it's like an 80% increase in your contact patch. Grip, of course, is a factor of temperature, the mu of the tarmac and so on and so forth.
We're going to move on from doing this to adding some of this. Now this is where we start to talk about the Ackerman principle. This is where you start to talk about the Ackerman principle, not me.
Indeed. Well, I think you can see, and it's kind of understandable, how this can all pivot up and down. These stay in line with the forks, it's all working, the suspension is soaking up the bumps, keeping the wheel and the tyre in contact with the road, but we have to turn as we go through a corner. Now, because you have 2 wheels, they actually need to go through a different arc. So the inside wheel has to turn tighter than the outside wheel. So the steering has a traditional column here, through bearings, through the linkage to effectively the steering column through the normal frame. That comes out the bottom here. And if you think go-karts at this point, so when you've got the shaft coming from your steering wheel, then there's a little offset. Exactly that. So this is just a bit more vertical than you would find on a go-kart. So what effectively happens is the steering comes through here. You've made your steering input. This is a steering tie rod effectively. And you've asked it to go to the right. So it's pushed the tie rod to the right. The clever part is in the offsets, here and here.
Yep.
Because that's what gives you your Ackerman principle. So hard to see on camera, but I can tell you that the inside wheel has turned tighter than the outside.
So Jeff, one of the other questions that's been pitched to us quite a bit from people online is the maintenance schedule and the difference between this and a traditional motorcycle. I think it's fairly obvious that there's going to be an increase in tyre bill because there's more tyre to replace. But this bit here, how much extra work is this creating and how much bigger a bill am I going to get when I come to have my Niken serviced over my MT-09?
These are essentially sealed bearings. They're fairly straightforward rockers and pivots. You know, how often do you grease your headstock bearings? Exactly. So actually, service-wise, it should be pretty much the same as a MT-09 or a Tracer 900.
Yep. So Jeff, we've spoken about this enough. We're about to have, I think, one of those Blue Peter moments where we move from inside to outside. We can stick a camera on the front of this bike and show people what's going on with all of this while we're riding it. Now, the only other question that we pitched to you when you showed us this bike for the first time back in November was one that, for me, is very close to my heart and very important indeed. I don't know if you can remember what it is.
I do, John. And it was a question that many people have asked. And you've answered, I think, will it wheelie?
Let's find out. Oh, here we are now outside with this slightly Heath Robinson rig on the front that we've set up to just give you a little bit more of an understanding of what's going on when this bike's on the move. So this is a private road, this is a pre-production bike. I'm wearing a jacket, you just can't quite see it, and we're going to have a little tickle around the car park so that you can see what's going on. Just going to ride round the cameraman. There is no resistance, there is just this kind of confidence, slightly stabilised feeling that I really like. It's not trying to track anywhere, it's not trying to pull me anywhere I don't want to go, even when I'm going up and down through these gutters. Like I said earlier, just a slight feeling like a normal motorbike with a steering damper that's too tight. I like it. This may well be the bike that keeps you, I want to say on two wheels for a bit longer, but on three wheels for a bit longer. So, hopefully that gave everybody a little bit more of an idea of what's going on. And now maybe, Jeff, we can talk about the next step for potential Niken owners, which is the Niken Tour. Coming soon to a biker cafe near you, is that right?
Yeah, we're going to have 3 opportunities for people in the UK to ride this bike. There's a tour going all over Europe, and we fully understand that it's very new technology. People need to experience it for themselves.
Yep.
Yamaha Motor GB on Facebook. Check our website, yamaha-motor.co.uk, and all the dates and venues will be on there in the next week or so.
The last thing to talk about is exactly what this bike feels like to ride. Now, we can cover off one thing immediately before we talk about the handling and dynamic appeal that this bike might have by just covering off the motor. It's very, very simple. The bike is still great at producing power and torque. One thing they've done that's different to other bikes that carry CP3 is they've increased the webs on the crank by about 18%, which doesn't increase the torque figure or decrease the torque figure, but it just slightly alters the characteristic of the motor and the way that it develops its power and torque. Much the same as MT10 has a slightly revised crank compared to R1. It just seems to slightly slow that fizzy, kind of hyperactive nature of this motor. Now, bizarrely, and almost at odds with that, they've also added a couple of extra teeth to the rear sprocket. So they've almost geared it down so that it accelerates faster, and they've increased the weight of the crank so that it revs slower. Other simple things that we should cover off are the levels of comfort. It is a very, very comfortable place to sit. These bars aren't very much wider than you would normally expect to find on any bike. I think actually a Super Tenere is marginally wider. This bike isn't as wide as you think. It's also very comfortable. The distance between foot, ass, hands and where your head ends up in relation to the screen, which is normally here, provides you with a very comfortable place to sit and watch the world roll by. If you do choose to watch the world roll by, take it very slowly. This bike will be a perfect kind of touring tool for you. You could stick somebody on the back quite comfortably and just start rattling off the miles. Now, obviously, if you go on a bike press launch and you add one journo to 9 other journos, the last thing anybody wants to do is ride slowly. So we didn't. We all pretty much rode as fast as we could. This was where the first change was very much visible to me within 3 or 4 minutes of leaving the hotel, when once people had finished weaving in the road like they were trying to warm up their tyres and get their head around what was going on with the front end, everybody started going fast straight away. Blind corners, corners that we didn't know the conditions, we didn't know what was coming around those corners. People just seemed to settle quite quickly into a pace that I'm going to say was slightly faster than average for a press launch. So what does that confidence equate to? How does it feel when you're on the bike? Well, what I found on this was just this kind of safety blanket of stability that this whole system provides. The great thing about safety aids like ABS or traction control, for those that are risk averse, they increase your safety net. They make you feel safer when you're riding them. If you're a bit of a tit, what those things do is allow you to push your limit, to push the envelope and just see how much more you can get away with. So rather than thinking, well, ABS is there to save me in the event of something really, really bad happening, some people think, well, I've got ABS. I can brake as hard as possible, as late as possible, and this bike's going to look after me. I think that is pretty much what this system started to do for us on the 250 kilometers that we covered in Kitzbühel. One of the more telling things for me wasn't necessarily what I was getting away with, it was what other people that I was riding with were getting away with. Now, if you watched the TT recently, you would have seen Mike Booth from Fast Bikes magazine flying around the TT, raced the Super Stock, raced Super Sport. He is a rapido rider. He's also absolutely loose as a goose. Following him is it's like that box of chocolates in that Tom Hanks movie. You never quite know what you're going to get. One minute he's doing 100-mile-an-hour stoppies, next minute he's trying to get the pegs down in a straight line. It's great fun to follow, but you've just always got to be ready to move out of his way. Handily, I had the GoPro on my chest when I followed him into a couple of hairpin bends, and he took immediate advantage of that 45 degrees of lean that this bike is capable of achieving, stuck the thing on the peg, and then stuck it on more than the peg, picked the back wheel up, and the bike came round. It was fine. He laughed it off, we laughed it off. He did it at the next corner, and then he did it at the next corner, and then he did it at the next corner. Again, getting back to that point that I was talking about earlier, the confidence that this instills in fast riders, let alone average riders, is massive. Stacks and stacks of fun. Now, there is one other thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about this front end, and it's the brakes. The brakes on this bike are compromised by those 15-inch wheels. There's a little bit of a feeling that the increased weight that this whole system has at the front is also handicapped somewhat by the size of the caliper and the discs that are used to slow it down. Remember, this is a 263 kilogram bike, so it is a hefty old bear. But I think the confidence that this inspires in you by far outweighs the somewhat limited nature of the brakes on this bike. So other toys that Niken has that would make this bike a very capable touring machine, you have quick shifter, a la GT900 Tracer, you have cruise control, you have a screen that works, in as much as, you know, my 5'11" frame was absolutely fine. It's just a very comfortable and capable place to be. If you've managed to make it this far into this review, I think you're probably ready to go and have a test ride. If you saw it and in the first 20 seconds you clicked off, there's not a lot that I can say that's going to convince you to go and ride this bike. What I will say is I went into the test ride with my eyes wide open and I left my preconceptions at home. I'm really glad I did. We had so much fun on this bike in the dry. Let's not even talk about what happened when it started pissing with rain. The last 40 kilometers of our ride, it was bouncing off the floor. Again, what usually happens, we all stop, pull over, stick our waterproofs on, and just kind of waddle like ducks back to the hotel, talk about what heroes we were, get drunk, everything's great. What we did on this one was actually, everybody just carried on enjoying the ride. There is so much confidence that this front end inspires in you, in me, that what I found was that I wasn't really riding very much slower. I certainly wasn't taking as much care as I usually would have to on a traditional motorbike. Because you don't need to worry so much about front end grip because it's just being taken care of for you, you start getting on the gas earlier, you start driving off apexes a little bit harder, you start to lean on the traction control a little bit more, or you start to turn the traction control off and just slightly let the bike have a little move on the way out of a corner. That's not my style. I'm not normally that guy who's absolutely charging off corners full gas, giggling like a loon bag. This definitely helped me to do that for just one day in the wet and the dry out in Kitzbühel. One thing I did notice throughout the whole ride, and particularly towards the end of the day when everything was soaking wet, was the clock set I think is lost in the mass of plastic that surrounds it across the dash. So where all of these clothes normally sit, there's a huge black plastic section that sits here, and the clocks sit about there. Because the backing on the clocks is black and there's so much black around it, it wasn't always easy to just drop my eyes down and pick up the speedo section on the clocks. So you may have noticed that this piece is longer than usual, and that's because obviously there's a little bit more to say than the average motorbike. Now's a good time to mention the price. It's 13,499 quid. If your jaw's on the floor and you just can't see any way of justifying that price for this bike isn't for you. Yamaha have built this bike for early adopters, guys that want next year's iPhone today, and the bike will be available in September. You can pre-order one now. If you are that early an adopter that you feel the need to click onto the Yamaha website, go and do that now, register your interest, pay your deposit, do all that kind of stuff. Of all of the bikes that I've ridden, where I've tried to finish and say go and take a test ride, this is the one that you've got to go and have a look at for yourself. So Jeff, one last question. It took 6 months for me to get a chance to find out if it wheelies, and yes it did. What's this bike like on track?
We don't know yet.